So some of you know that Steven has been having some hard times lately, and apparently they just took a turn for the worse. So I wanted to do an early reading of his book as a show of solidarity and support for what he's going through right now. And I would ask all of you to keep him in your thoughts and send him love, send him energy any way you can. If you have him on Messenger, or send him a YouTube message or something, send it through the ether. Anyway, I'm gonna do an hour instead of half an hour. So we're on his story that he was going to give to his crush. This was before college applications were expected to be turned in. They were young and they still felt young. And you know what else? His hair was long and he still went by Billy and not Bill. Her lip was pierced and her hair was not brushed. But they didn't care. They listened to music loud and they drove like immortals would. Trees were still meant for climbing and not for shade, and fun was the object of every game, not winning. That's the planet they lived on. They lived in the moment. They lived in our nostalgia. And when the time came to come up for air, they sucked in until both of their lungs hurt. Then they smiled because they could still feel pain. Billy sat beneath the sound of swaying leaves. This is the story of his beginning, maybe his end. But still he sat there with his legs crossed, his jeans stained with bleach and caked along the bottom with mud. The faded jacket that his grandmother gave him clung to his shoulders like it was indecisive about whether it should stay on or fall off. He tucked the hair that hung in his face behind his left ear and suckled on the butt of a cigarette, tossing his journal back into his messenger bag. Emily sat down behind him, wrapping her legs around his waist and her arms around his neck. Light kisses hit him. He could feel the moisture of her lips as they dragged across his cheek and collarbones. In a hot whisper, she said, "Let's go, lover." They walked hand in hand together under the canopy of oak leaves and over the sea of long silver puddles, mirrors that showed their youth and magnificent acne. When they hit St. Lawrence Stream, their clothes fell off in one beautiful stroke. With two booming splashes, they were absorbed into nature. Seconds later, he was absorbed into her, their tongues melting against each other. Her taste to him was like green olives. Their bodies made waves in that stream. Above them hung the tire swing they grew up with. Images of perfection. The way the water felt cold between their legs. The way the trees rocked with them, moaned with them. The way the sun smiled. Perfection. Billy lit another cigarette as he put his pants back on. He didn't wear underwear. "Those things will kill you," Emily said, as she placed a peck on his cheek and put her bra back on. Billy watched her hands curl behind her back, and he thought about how beautiful she was at that moment, how very feminine. He shrugged. "You gotta die sometime," he replied, in an exhale of bright gray smoke. They walked back to their neighborhood, reborn. They were gods returning to Olympus. The leaves fell behind them, and the sun sloped into the faded purple west. I walked to my desk a beaten man. Thupton looked at me, and I knew exactly what happened before I could even say anything. I didn't speak. I barely moved. I pulled out my red notebook and wrote, "Brown eyes betray me." I heard Thupton whisper something that was borderline mean. "I told you so, Jacob." "Die, Thupton." "I love you, Jacob." And he did. I knew he did. I started writing a new story, and I never finished it, and I never will. Puddles hung to the mud around him. Long silver mirrors that caught his broken heart and falling droplets. The cacophony of the crowded, cramped city was blocked out by thunder. The sky was almost too bright for a storm, and in his silence he predicted a rainbow behind him, where the sun hid. In the puddle he saw himself, then a drop would disturb the surface, and he would become a monster. He couldn't tell anymore if it was his tears or the rain, both possibly. He had dropped out of high school. He lost Emily. All of his plans were dead ends. His head hung, and his journal was wrinkled and faded in the rainwater. His old neighborhood was just a ghost to him now, and everything seemed dead. His wallet was empty except for her picture. She was just a blur now. Her face and eyes that made him glow were now empty globes, disgusting and liquid. The entries she wrote for him in his journal were only fading whispers now. The entire town and the kisses and the lies, all gone. He decided that maybe he was better off alone. Just a ghost himself. Dead. This was my struggle with love. This was my wrestle with God. If God is love, and with love comes empathy, and with empathy comes pain, who would want to love God? I scratched my pencil across the paper in little zigzag words that I couldn't decipher when I read them later. The blue notebook lines were faded from splashing tears. I ripped out the page of my notebook and creased it neatly. I was having a secret funeral for my make-believe relationship, imagining the page was an American flag draped over a casket, being tightly folded by a Marine. I tucked the triangle of paper into a pocket of the notebook. Can there be an end to something that never existed? I thought. I was vaguely aware that Miss Bessett put on Romeo and Juliet for the class to watch. How appropriate. The best love tragedy ever written just had to be played in my class on this day. It was the pretty black and white version. I watched it with unblinking eyes, my hands supporting my quivering chin, my armpits wrung with the hysterical sweat of a broken heart. I watched the movie, but I was in another world. This world was a treacherous place. The sky was black with ash clouds, and the only light I could see was from brief bursts of lightning. Instead of trees, there were large black sucker-covered tentacles that rose from the ground and wagged back and forth like the blind tails of dogs. The ground was cracked red clay. In this despairing world, I was alone. I was without. In Latin, they call that des, to be without. This was my des world. In the years to come, I would grow very familiar with its landscapes, its blank pages, its sole occupant, my depression incarnate. This was the first time I visited the des world. Destroyed love would often send me here. It takes a lot to send me back home to the land of Des, where Des is the emperor of disarray. Long black hair block out his eyes, iridescent fairy wings. Feet and hands too large to fly. All day long he whines and wails, shouting out eternal hells. Ever born, shall never die. It is here that he is king, Lucifer. Out of the dark clouds of death's world came a large white hand, white like snow, sugar, milk. The hand lifted me up by my shoulder and pulled me out of my depression with a simple touch. Flash. Back to reality. Half of the movie was over. About 5 minutes had gone by in my head, like Kronos again. I had my hand in my pocket, where the orbs of time awaited my temporal commands. Thubden's palm was on my shoulder, massaging away the strain of depression. It rose from my body like a dying fever, like steam from boiling water. It will be all right, Jacob. Everything will be fine. You didn't know her. In pain, I found love, Thubden's. He kept whispering to me, and I kept listening to him, letting his words blend my thoughts into a smooth, pasty peace. Buddhists have an odd way of shedding peace on desperate souls. I want to see both of you after class, Miss Bessett snarled. It came to my ears like it was echoing down a tunnel. Thubden's voice replied softly, "Yes, ma'am." His hand was gone. The words were gone. Deep sighs were in my lungs. My eyes were a blurred, stained glass windows. I just wanted to fall in love. I wanted to have a girl in my life that would take care of me. I never had that before. Before I knew it, the bell was ringing. I picked up my 1,000-pound book bag with sad, tired arms and trudged to the door. Jacob, I asked you to see me after class. I looked back, and the class was empty except for Thubden and Miss Bessett. Oh. She sat down on top of her desk. She had her blonde curls up in a bun, held together by 2 crossed chopsticks. She had on her long green skirt and flip-flops that were made out of bamboo. Thubden. She looked at Thub. Jacob. She looked at me. I just want to know why the two of you insist on talking during class, writing during class, or just completely ignoring class altogether. She was upset at our disregard. I don't even think she noticed how depressed I looked. I'm so sorry, Miss Bessett. I really am. Jacob was just upset. I was trying to make him feel better, Thubden said. I'm not upset, Thub. I'm fine, Miss Bessett, I added. She looked at me closely, for the first time noticing how sad I looked. She furrowed her eyebrows when she locked eyes with me. Without looking over at him, she said, "You can go to the bus, Thubden." He began to walk away. Jacob, please come over to my house to spend the night. I don't want you going home after all that stuff. Okay, Thub, I'll get off at your stop, I said. He nodded and exited the classroom like a mouse scurrying into his hole. Poor Thubden hated getting in trouble. He would probably go home and pout all night. What's wrong, Jacob? Nothing. Please tell me. I really want to know what's bothering you. I already told you, nothing. I'm fine. Really. She paused. Please tell me, Jacob. I promise I won't tell anyone. I'm just concerned for your safety. You want to know what's wrong with me? You really want to know what's wrong? Yes, I do. Fine, I'll tell you. My mother got beat up last night by her boyfriend. I had to sleep over at the pastor's. On top of that, I don't have Emily anymore. I don't have anyone. She broke my heart. She carved out my heart. That's what's wrong with me. I don't have my snail. I'm always out of my shell, but no one is there to be with me. Just that big red bird on a branch. I don't have anyone who loves me like that. I flung the poem around in the air by one of its edges. I don't even have anyone to take care of me. I was crying, sobbing, wheezing. The first part of that poem is how the snail has to wait for love. You have to be patient, Jacob. I mean, you were just in high school, and you were young even for your classes. Once you get my age, and you are still single like me, then you can start getting worried. I'm 30, Jacob, and I still haven't found that other snail yet. Well, what about that guy who wrote the poem for you? We broke up. Why? Because of some fundamental disagreements between us. He has a kid. He has an ex-wife. He has a very demanding job. I got impatient. My biological clock is ticking. I had to end it so I could have my own child one day. I still care about him. Sometimes that sort of thing happens. Sometimes it's better if it ends. I'm so sorry, Miss Bessett. Here I am all upset about a girl that I never even talked to, and you have this real relationship with real love and it's gone. I'm so sorry. I looked up at the clock. Oh crap, but I've got to scram. The bus is going to leave me. I turned around and headed for the door. Hold on a second, mister. I'm not done with you. I called in your father and mother, and we are going to have a conference with them today. Why? I thought you understood me. Don't call them in. My dad will be sad, and my mother will tell Mr. Riley, and he will hit me. Come on, I'm going to miss the bus. I have to go home with my mother. Please don't do this. No, not a bad meeting, Jacob. A good one. Plus, I already called them in. We're going to discuss your stories, like the one I saw you writing today. I held my bag close to my chest. No, it's personal. My mother can't read it. She just can't. She doesn't even like me. Plus, she got the crap kicked out of her last night. How is she supposed to come to a PTA conference after that? Listen, Jacob, that story you wrote in class the other day was fantastic. You need to be in an even more accelerated English class, maybe a seniors class. I think one of the reasons you were acting out is because you were so bored. We are doing things that are far below your skill level. And about you having to go home to your mother's house, I will give you a ride to Thubton's after we are done with our meeting, okay? I nodded. Okay. I sat down at my desk with my books hugged close to me. There was no one on earth that could make me read my stories to my mother. I would die first. I sat down at my desk and nervously tapped my feet while I waited for one of my parents to arrive. Miss Bessett was working on her computer, entering grades and humming a soft tune to herself. Thubton was already on the bus, probably looking out the window, waiting for me to emerge through the double doors. I can't even imagine what he was thinking whenever the bus took off without me. So when are my parents supposed to be here? They should be here within the next 15 minutes or so, I would think. She turned up her radio and began to sing along to a chorus I was familiar with, but I couldn't pinpoint the exact band. Oh, that's just great, I thought. I have to put up with my mother in public. She's probably already pissed at having to drive down here after work and having to deal with my father at the same time. Miss Bessett might as well have ordered my death sentence. No matter how good the meeting was, my mother would be displeased at its slight inconvenience. If I were to win the Nobel Peace Prize, my mother wouldn't go out of her way to go to the award ceremony unless there was an open bar. I rested my head on my books in my crossed arms and thought about Emily. I wished that I was at Thupton's house, listening to one of his new albums. I wish he was here to rub my back the way he did. I silently started to cry, but regained my composure whenever I heard my father's voice down the hall asking for directions to my class. He entered the classroom precisely when he was supposed to, 4:30 on the dot. My father always had a way of doing that. Miss Bessett turned back to her work. I wiped my sweaty red face free of tears and took a long look at my father. He took an equally long look back at me. I hadn't seen him in a few weeks, and it made me happy to see him again, regardless of the circumstance. He was wearing blue jeans that hung tight to his thin chicken legs and a blue striped shirt that was neatly tucked into them. He had started to grow back his mustache, which was now completely gray. I was glad. So, I can see by looking at him that he is pretty sorry for whatever he did, but I still got to ask what the little hellion did this time to upset the balance of your classroom. A tension filled the air, which the room suddenly felt very short of. My father looked at Miss Bessett the way he used to look at my mom in the old photo album I kept under my bed. "Oh no, Mr. Shepherd, nothing of the sort. This is actually a good meeting. It is about his excellent progress. I believe he is red in the face for a completely unrelated reason." My father approached my desk and knelt down to look me square in the eyes. "Well then, why are you so upset looking, son?" "Some girl, it's nothing." "Girls have a way of doing that, Jacob." He said this louder than expected. Loud enough for Miss Bessett to hear all the way across the room, sitting at her desk. She mumbled something that I couldn't make out. "What was that, Andrea?" my father said. "In the classroom, it's Miss Bessett, please, Mr. Shepherd." "Excuse me, ma'am." "Did you have a concern you wished to express to me or my son?" My father dragged a bigger desk that was beside me to the center of the room. It made a terrible loud screech as he pulled it. He had a seat facing both myself and Miss Bessett. I said, "Boys have a way of doing that as well, Jacob." I didn't understand what was going on. There was an awkward tension in the room. Following my father's suit, I stood up and dragged my desk beside his and sat down. I reached into my book bag and pulled out The Slow Dance of the Snails to rub in my palm, like the mint Thupton gave me for Emily, which I jostled in my pocket nervously but never used. Miss Bessett continued her computer work and turned off her radio. My father was gazing around the room, strangely silent. Typically, whenever he was in the room with some other adult, he made casual chit-chat. He saw that I was holding something and asked what it was. I told him it was a poem, something Bessett gave me. Miss Bessett gave me. "Don't let him see that, Jacob," Miss Bessett shouted out at me, standing up in such a rush that she nearly knocked her chair over. For the first time, the two of them connected eyes. "Let me see that." My father quickly snatched the poem out of my hand and unfolded it. "You still have this piece of crap?" my father said with a smile as he unfolded the creased poem. Miss Bassett scurried over to my father and tried to pull it out of his fist, but it was held tight. "It isn't a piece of crap. I loved that poem. Now give it back, please." "No." "Please, Jacob. Please tell your father to stop acting like a child." I sat silent and watched like a hawk. "I wrote it. I can keep it," my father barked. My mouth fell open. They continued to wrestle over the poem, and my father got pushed out of his desk by Miss Bassett. Suddenly the paper tore, and Miss Bassett's struggle against my father fell limp, her hands retreating to her sides. She returned to her desk with watery eyes, head hanging low, a defeated look painted across her face. "Andrea, I'm sorry. Miss Bassett stopped him. "Okay, I suppose your mother isn't going to show up, Jacob. We should begin our meeting, Mr. Shepherd." Her voice wavered and shook like autumn leaves, Indian summer. I couldn't believe that my father was my favorite teacher's old boyfriend. I couldn't believe that my father was capable of writing so well. Even beyond that, I couldn't believe Miss Bassett tolerated me in her class, knowing that I was my father's son. I guess I understood why she thought I was writing poetry in her class. Maybe she wanted to put me in a more advanced class, because she couldn't keep looking at my face, knowing I was a part of why her only chance at love didn't pan out. I was the childhood Kronos that had stolen precious tick-tocks from her biological clock. I guess if I were her, I would have trouble looking at me every day of the week too. "Okay, so what's this meeting all about if it isn't about his attitude?" my father asked. Miss Bassett turned in her desk, adjusting her bun, making the wandering strands return to their original position. Both of her hands were on her desk and clasped into a cute but authoritative ball that bobbed up and down, thumping the wood as she talked. "Well, Mr. Shepherd, your son, Jacob, is gifted with the English language. More so than many of his classmates, who are also advanced and older than him. He's very creative and incredibly articulate for his age. His grasp of poetry is far beyond others in his grade, and even the grade above him. His short stories are..." My father turned to me and interrupted. "When did you start writing stories, Jacob?" "Please let me continue, Mr. Shepherd," Miss Bassett went on. "His writing is beautiful, a joy for me to read. With very little editing, he could get some of the things I've read published. It is my recommendation, after having graded his second flawless paper, that he be moved to a junior level English class." My father sat still in thought, looking out the window of the classroom. The sun was dying down behind the neighboring buildings. A flock of pigeons invaded the courtyard, looking for leftovers from lunch. He sat like this for quite some time, until suddenly he spoke. "Miss Bassett, Andrea, if I may. There is not a person in the world that I would rather have my son learning English from. In my eye, there is no one more qualified to teach him poetry, to read him fiction, or to edit his papers. Since your first words with me, I knew you were a famous poet reincarnate. So I respectfully decline your offer to accelerate my son again. Once a year is enough." "Yeah, I like your class, Miss Bassett, and I would miss Thoob too much." "Well, I believe, as his teacher, it would be better for Jacob in the long run, Mr. Shepherd. And I, Miss Bessett, as Jacob's father, disagree. Well, let me show you some of his scores. She proceeded to pore over test after test, quiz after quiz, homework grade after homework grade from 3 different English teachers I had had over the past 2 years. Even personal notes of my acting out as an obvious expression of my boredom. She presented cold, hard facts. My father shot them down like clay pigeons as soon as they were thrown out in front of him. I am adamant about my decision to leave Jacob in your class, Miss Bessett. I'm very sorry if you disagree, but as his parent, I will have to decline your offer. Well, we will see what his mother has to say about that tonight when I pay her a visit. I thought that she was going overboard. This was hardly a regular PTA conference. I guess we will, Andrea. You never know when to stop fighting a lost battle. This was an entire waste of time, Joseph. Jacob, I've got to get on the road. Call me before you come over this week and we'll plan something for dinner, okay? I didn't respond immediately. I was lost somewhere, hidden inside of myself. Okay, Dad. Goodbye again, Andrea. And goodbye to you, Mr. Shepherd. Thank you for destroying that poem. I had been meaning to do it myself for some time now. My father stood up, picked up, and returned his desk to the corner of the room, and left without a second glance. Miss Bessett and I sat there for a while, eyeballing each other sadly. Just when I was about to ask her one of the many questions flooding my brain, she dashed out of the room and returned several minutes later with her eyeshadow and mascara running down her cheeks in black streaks. I could tell she only halfway tried to wipe them away. Ready to go to your mother's house, Jacob? I thought you would take me to Thubes. Well, you need clothes, don't you? And besides, I'd like to see why your mother decided not to show up for a conference, and what she thinks about you going to a more accelerated English class. Miss Bessett tossed her hemp book satchel onto her shoulder. She sniffled, the remnants of a terrible cry frenzy. I decided maybe it would be better if I didn't ask any questions. She walked tall and proud, the way a queen would walk if she lost her king. We left the classroom in silence. The entire drive to my mother's trailer, we didn't talk. Miss Bessett stuck a cassette in her tape deck. She told me later that the band was Commander Venus. The album was The Uneventful Vacation. The song was We'll Always Have Paris. She was watching the road, but she was seeing something else that afternoon. Something I saw when I looked at Emily. Something Brandon saw every morning on the bus, and probably even what my mother saw in Mr. Riley. We climbed up my driveway in Miss Bessett's tiny white hatchback. Behind the trees, I could make out 2 vehicles, a car and Mr. Riley's large pickup truck. I felt like pissing myself, but then I remembered that he had no way of moving his truck after he was locked up last night. Maybe his wife hadn't picked it up yet. Maybe, hopefully, he was still in jail where he belonged. I walked up the brick steps of my tiny trailer's porch. Miss Bessett was behind me. She had her hands on her hips. She looked scared. Looking back, I can understand how she must have felt confronting my mother, the ex-boyfriend's ex-wife, the source of all her jealousy and feelings of inadequacy, and doing so under professional circumstances. Did my mother know about Miss Bessett? I opened the door and walked inside. I could hear laughter coming from inside the kitchen. Miss Bessett hesitated to walk in with me when she saw the war scene in my living room. She looked at me like I was a poor boy living on the street. I didn't care at the moment. I only concentrated on the voices. Mr. Riley was there. My stomach was bubbling. My knees started to ache. My head swam and I nearly fell. I wanted to run away and cry, but I only snuck off to my bedroom. Jacob, where are you going? Get your mother for me first before you pack your bags. She was desperate and probably terrified as well. Jacob. It was too late. I was gone to my land of death. Miss Bessett banged on the door. Hello, Mrs. Shepherd? I heard the ominous sound of a chair pulling back away from the kitchen table. The laughter stopped. I held my breath and reached into my backpack, tapping the golden orbs of my old clock, hoping to fast forward reality. When that plan failed, I simply looked for clothes to stuff into my bag. My mother was in her mean queen phase. Or maybe Miss Bessett just brought that side of my mother out naturally. She stood in the doorway, hand on the threshold, supporting her drunken sway, blocking one of my 2 exit routes. The other led me past Mr. Riley, who still sat in the kitchen. I stood frozen and watched from the hallway, bags packed. What you doing here, tramp? My mother shouted at Miss Bessett. I guess they had met before, after all. I said, what you doing here? My mother drooled as she spoke. I'm here to talk about your son, Miss Shepherd. But I can come back later if this is a bad time. Not wanting to engage my mother while she was so obviously drunk, she turned to walk away. Where are you running off to, tramp? My mother drawled. I imagined Miss Bessett could have lit a match next to my mother's mouth and flames would have shot out. Pure liquor was flooding through her blood, and I'm sure Andrea knew that in this state, Sheila was capable of almost anything. I'll talk to you again when you are more feeling up to it. I'm feeling up to it now, tramp. Where's your little prickless boyfriend at? She slurred messily, then turned to yell down the hall to Mr. Riley. Honey, come see what the cat drug in. My ex-husband's new fling is begging on my doorstep. I said, what you want? Another chair pulled back away from the kitchen table. Mr. Riley and his eyes like burning coals. This time, I really did pee a little bit. I tried to run to the front door before Mr. Riley got there, but it was too late. He stood beside my mother, gigantic and straight, like a proud devil. Who's this pretty little thing? He said to my mother, motioning to Miss Bessett. My mother hesitated angrily. This here's my ex's new sweetie pie. Says she is here to kick my ass. She pouted and stroked his barrel chest in an attempt to tear his eyes away from the new female, which had the misfortune of wandering into his territory. I said no such thing, Miss Shepherd, Miss Bessett said boldly, finding her own inner Mustang. What's the matter, slut? He thinks about me when he screws you, doesn't he? You can't beat my ass. Come on and try it. My mother swayed, head bobbing like a drunk, not a boxer. Half of her face was black and swollen. She put up her fists like she was about to fight, Only one eye was able to open fully, the other in a permanent wink. Mr. Riley did a number on her, and she didn't even seem to notice. I said I am here to talk about your son, but I guess Jacob has enough in his life to deal with right now, without having to worry about school. Jacob? What does it have to do with anything? This is about me and you. No, this is about Jacob and bettering his education, but I will leave this decision up to his father, since you aren't able to think rationally. Miss Bassett, knowing very well that no good could possibly come out of this situation, began to walk away. And besides, Miss Shepherd, your ex-husband and I are no longer seeing each other. Oh, get rid of his ass for a real man like I did? You need to get your hands on a big fella like Henry here. My mother reached over to her side where Mr. Riley was leaning against the doorway, half asleep. She grabbed his crotch through his coveralls. My mother smiled brightly at Miss Bassett, shy a single tooth that Mr. Riley had removed for her. Miss Bassett headed down the steps, and Mr. Riley turned to kiss my mother in a hot, lusty way, tongue slashing around like a camel's, drool on her chin. As Miss Bassett reached the bottom of the steps, I remembered where I was. My hands sweaty, my eyes watering, pee soaking my underwear. She was going to leave me here. I couldn't stay here. He would kill me. No, I whispered. No, a little louder. Please don't leave me here. I whimpered, my voice trembling, a deluge of tears aching to burst out of me. Miss Bassett, don't leave me here. I ran past the two lovers toward the kitchen door, my only exit. Mr. Riley looked over at me, eyes like a cannibal, his mouth still cupped wetly around my mother's. The kiss ended. How did you get home? My mother yelled as I ran. She was barely aware of the situation. I burst out the door before Mr. Riley had a chance to react to me in his drunken state. I darted toward Miss Bassett's hatchback, screaming, crying, flailing around my bag stuffed with laundry and toiletries, pleading for her to take me with her. She popped open her car door as she drove in reverse and signaled for me to get in with a motion of her hand. I threw my bag in and jumped in alongside it. Weak and exhausted with fright, I said, "Thank you." "Jacob, darling, anytime, anything, at all. I had no idea." She was crying herself. I think that, at that exact moment, she forgave me for being the byproduct of her old love's old marriage. I think she saw my life in a new light. She stopped backing up and turned to face me. "I knew that you had it rough. I saw the bruises. But I had no idea it was always like this. You were just Joseph's son. But when I looked at you, I saw him. I just never made it up in my mind to help you. I just wanted you to move on, like he did. It hurt too bad to see you every day. Jacob, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Don't be." I didn't care about her revelations about my personal life, or hers, even though her shell was down and she was offering love. I didn't care about Joseph or Israel. I just wanted to get the hell away from that trailer. I could forgive her later. "Can we just go, please?" "Yes." She looked back and took her foot off the brake. "Of course we can, darling." And we were gone from that place. There was no looking back now. It felt like I had almost never had to come back, though my rational mind knew that it wasn't at all true. For that one moment, trapped in time, I was free. The white Mustang inside of me had finally cleared the fence. As we headed to Thubton's house, I got Miss Bessett to stop by Pastor Casey's parsonage to pick up Panic. She got out of the car and told me to stay in. She went up to the door and knocked. Pastor Casey answered. They talked for a few minutes, both sporadically turning back to look at me, concern creasing their faces. Pastor Casey walked over to my car door and opened it, asking how I was doing. I said okay. He told me that we should maybe look into moving me in with my father. I explained to him that my mother had full custody, and as long as the checks kept coming, she would keep it that way. My dad is always talking to lawyers, but little ever gets done. He nodded and told me that he would check in with me when he was able and to be safe. A smile passed between us. He reassured me the way only a white aura could. Panic ran out the front door as Pastor Casey went back into his tiny wooden parsonage. I opened my door and Panic jumped into my lap and wiggled his way into the back of the hatchback, curling into a quiet and respectful ball. Miss Bessett walked back over to the car and got in after waving her goodbyes to the pastor. Your dog is really well behaved, Jacob. How long have you been training him? Oh, I didn't train him. He just showed up a few days ago, and he's been hanging around me ever since. His last master must have trained him well. I suppose so, but he was really hungry when I found him. If they trained him well, they didn't keep him well fed. He has eaten really good since he caught up with me. Maybe that's why he hangs around. I smiled at her. She turned onto the highway leading to Thubton's house. It was nice of you to take in a stray and feed him so well. She smiled back at me. I hoped this exchange meant something deeper to her. We pulled up to Thubton's house, and I got out of the car holding my bag. They lived in a middle-class, suburban neighborhood with exceptionally sized yards, ample room to stretch your legs. Panic followed me, and Miss Bessett opened her car door. She pushed her sunglasses up on her forehead to clearly see Thubton's house. It was extraordinary. It had been designed and hand-built by Thubton's mom and dad. A tall bamboo thicket curled around a reflecting pool, and water constantly trickled through a winding stream pumped up to the surface from well below. They had massive gardens of herbs and flowers, and a thick fragrance of lavender and rosemary clung to every air particle. You could see where they grew their own food in large greenhouses and had above-ground storage for water. Thubton's mother, Betsy Tenzin, even had a pen behind the house with 3 or 4 goats she milked. The wind turbine that spun slowly above us on a recycled telephone pole was the only sound that could be heard above the leaping leaves of Indian summer, and the birds perched on their branches, calling out to their friends. Miss Bessett, Panic, and I made our way to the Tenzin front door. The path was a series of large rocks set in a shallow pool of water. Fish and frogs slashed around us. The dewy air didn't stir in the bamboo cul-de-sac, which held the Tenzin home like a panda's cradle. Panic found the rocks hard to navigate, and the fish jumping and spraying water on his face startled him. The orchestral doorbell sounded on its own as we tripped the infrared sensor positioned behind the stone path. The only windows were set high to capture sunlight and keep out prying eyes. A camera followed us to the door, which opened in front of us. "How are you two?" Thupton glowed as he greeted us. "I was worried when I didn't see you on the bus, Jacob." He stepped aside and offered his hand to Miss Bessett, guiding her inside his large home. I hopped inside and the door shut behind me, Panic still outside. A large automatic door opener had closed it behind me and the locks shut by themselves. Panic immediately began yelping and scratching at the wood. I went to open the door, but there was no handle. "Hey, Thub, why did it lock Panic out?" "Oh, it does that sometimes with dogs and small children." The head sensor inside detected only 2 people, and the computer assumed it was safe to shut and lock the door. My dad takes our security pretty seriously, and he likes not having to use knobs or keys, but inadvertently, we end up having to use keypads and joysticks. Thupton walked over to a keyboard by the door attached to the security monitors and typed in a 12-digit code. The door unlocked and opened on its own accord and began beeping. Panic ran in, and the door beeped a few more times until it slowly closing and locking once again. My parents aren't home right now. My dad went out to the hardware store, and Mom is teaching yoga until 7. "You are welcome to come in and sit down though, Miss Bessett. Jacob, just set your bag on the floor in the hallway." I went over to the hallway and put down my things. Miss Bessett and Panic followed Thupton into the Tenzin's living room. The art and architecture of their eclectic home reflected an interesting mixture of cultures. This was because Thupton's grandparents fled during the 1950s after Communist China occupied Tibet and ordered His Holiness the Dalai Lama to leave his homeland, the Buddhist Rome. They stayed in India for a few years with the other refugees and their 2 sons, but they soon found their way to the land of the free, the land of new beginnings, America. Thupton's mother was an Irish New Ager who fell in love with the mysticism of Eastern cultures and the dark skin and mysterious minds of Eastern men, like Thupton's father. "Thupton, your house is amazing. How did your family ever afford a place like this? Isn't your father a teacher?" "It looks like a bomb shelter and a postmodern Robert Venturi masterpiece rolled up into a piece of science fiction." Miss Bessett was sitting on a long red couch that was fashioned out of concrete and attached to the floor, which was also concrete. All of Thupton's furniture was bolted to the ground, or a built-in feature of the floor. All of the walls and ceiling and floors were slightly rounded and also molded from concrete. Thupton sat down on a love seat, and I joined him. Panic had a seat on the cold floor, rolling over on his back and panting. All of the furniture encircled a solid granite coffee table, covered in books and a swiveling 6-hosed hookah. It was obvious that the Tenzin family talked and read for entertainment. I had never known his family to have a television in the living room, but computers were a different story. His father had a laptop or desktop in every room. "Where are all the windows?" Miss Bessett asked. "Oh, over there in the greenhouse." Thupton pointed to a room hidden down a long, brightly illuminated hallway. "There are a few in here, but they only let the sun in until noon to heat up the thermal mass in the western portion of the house. Dad doesn't much care for windows. He says each window is a potential theft portal. He says the only thing windows are good for is letting in the sun and heating the house cheaply. And my family isn't too rich. The house is made mostly from recycled materials. My parents just spent a lot of time making it. Art. You know what I mean? Thank you for letting Jacob stay with you tonight. I'm sure it means a lot to him. Miss Bessett smiled at me. Jacob always spends the night over. Don't you, Jacob? He has better video games than I do. I smiled nervously, my feet swinging from the high love seat. It was odd having our English teacher in our audience, the three of us entertaining each other as equals. I would love a tour, Thupton. Well, my father kind of likes our privacy. I can show you my room, the bathroom, and the kitchen, but he has passcodes on all the other rooms, Thupton replied. I could tell this made her uncomfortable. Her face shifted to an expression of curiosity and confusion. Oh, it's okay, Thupton. I understand. She silently rose to her feet and shouldered her purse. Don't get me wrong, Miss Bessett, Thupton said. My dad is an inventor with over 30 works in progress, but he only has 2 patents, and he requires a strong security policy. Little did she know, many of the inventions he was working on were not patentable or legal. Miss Bessett grinned. I certainly understand then, Thupton. Inventors are always the quirkiest people. I heard that Thomas Edison created the light bulb because he was scared of bugs. She snickered coyly. Well, boys, I'll see the both of you tomorrow. Thupton, can you tell your robot to let me out? Surely, Miss Bessett. He rose and went over to the keyboard to open the front door. Please, Thupton, call me Andrea. All of my friends do, and both of you are my friends. She looked back at me, and I saw something in her eyes that I had never seen before. A slight stirring of tears and a sag in her shoulders. She looked at me like a worried mother. I responded emotionally to this look that I had never seen before, not even on my own mother's face. Jacob, you have my phone number on your syllabus in your reading folder. Call me if you need me. We will catch up after class. Sleep well, boys. Have fun playing video games. I walked over to the door as Thupton typed in the code. The door opened up by itself, as if it were a space shuttle's hatch being thrown open in a slow-motion vacuum. Light entered the dark architecture of the Tenzin home and brought with it the sounds of nature. The water held the light like a wavy silver mirror. Goodbye, Andrea, I said, half crying. She stood there silhouetted in the light, looking back at me, her bag on her hip and her arms crossed. I love you. I love the both of you. Never listen to the bad things people say about the two of you. You are both pure souls, and I know that the world will be your oyster one day. I know it. I can feel it in my bones. Stay safe, you two. Take care of each other. With that, she turned around and entered into the light. At that moment, I mistook her aura for Thupton's. It gleamed bright white. Like an angel, I would see her during a near-death experience, floating back into heaven as consciousness returned. Her glowing form grew smaller and smaller as she traversed the slick stones of the reflecting pool and slipped into the horizon of bamboo shade.
Stephen, we love you. We're here for you. We support you. And we're all grateful for everything that you've shared with us so far. And I wish you the best of luck. Be well. Thank you for your story. I enjoy reading it. Bye.